Sometimes the deepest grief finds its voice not in words, but in the work of weathered hands. When Elias Brandt lost everything that mattered, he discovered that healing doesn't come from moving on. It comes from building something that honors what you've lost. For $50, this mountain man bought a rusty old train car that folks called worthless junk. The townsfolk whispered he'd lost his mind, but Elias saw what they couldn't. He carried memories of a wife who loved him and a boy he never got to raise. Through quiet seasons, he worked alone, transforming that broken train car piece by piece. Each board he replaced, each window he fixed, told a story deeper than anyone imagined. What he built inside wasn't just shelter, it was something that would leave the whole town breathless. What could drive a man to pour everything he had left into rebuilding something everyone else had given up on? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The morning mist clung to Pine Ridge like an old man's memory, reluctant to let go of the valley that had sheltered it through the night. Elias Brandt walked the main street with the careful gait of someone who had learned not to hurry through life, his boots making soft impressions in the dust that would blow away before noon. The town stretched before him like a faded photograph. All weathered wood and honest wear, the kind of place where people still knew each other's troubles and triumphs by heart. Martha Henley emerged from her general store, wiping flour-dusted hands on her apron. She had the keen eyes of a woman who had watched this town grow from wilderness, and those eyes tracked Elias with the particular interest reserved for strangers who might stay long enough to matter. Her husband, Doc, had mentioned the quiet man who'd taken rooms above the saloon, paying a week in advance with coins that bore the tarnish of honest work. "Morning," she called out, her voice carrying the warmth that mountain folk reserve for those they're still deciding about. "You're the fellow looking at old railroad property." Elias touched the brim of his worn hat, a gesture so natural it spoke of a lifetime of such courtesies. "Yes, ma'am." Elias Brandt. He pulled a leather-bound notebook from his coat pocket, its pages thick with pencil sketches that caught Martha's attention. The drawings visible from her angle showed careful measurements, detailed joinery, the kind of precise craftsmanship that spoke of years spent turning raw timber into something beautiful. "That old train car's been sitting there since before the Spanish War," Martha said, stepping closer. "Railroad company just left it when they pulled up the main line. Figured it wasn't worth hauling away." She paused, studying the sketches more carefully. "Those your drawings?" The notebook held more than measurements. Page after page revealed the mind of a man who understood wood and metal, who could see beyond rust and rot to the bones of good construction underneath. There were sketches of furniture that would fit perfectly in narrow spaces, plans for windows that would capture morning light, detailed drawings of built-in cabinets that would make the most of every inch. "Spent some years working with my hands," Elias said simply. The understatement carried weight, like most truths spoken by men who had learned economy with words. In those sketches, Martha glimpsed a lifetime of knowledge joints that would hold for generations, proportions that pleased the eye without calling attention to themselves. The kind of work that came from understanding both the material and the purpose it would serve. Sheriff Cole emerged from the jailhouse across the street, his badge catching the early light. At 62, he moved with the deliberate confidence of a man who had kept peace in a place where peace mattered. His weathered face held the lines that came from squinting into mountain distances and making hard decisions with incomplete information. "Morning, Martha, Mr. Brandt." Cole had the gift of making introductions feel like continuations of conversations that had been going on for years. "Heard you're interested in that old Burlington Northern car." "Thinking about it," Elias replied. The three of them stood in the comfortable silence that mountain people understood, where words weren't needed to fill every moment. The notebook remained open in Elias's hands, revealing sketches that suggested not just renovation, but transformation. Doc Henley approached from his clinic, medical bag in hand, and the slightly distracted air of a man whose mind was always partly occupied with the needs of others. At 74, he remained the kind of physician who made house calls and accepted payment in whatever form people could manage. His eyes, sharp behind wire-rimmed spectacles, took in the gathering with the assessment of someone accustomed to reading the health of both bodies and communities. "Gentlemen," Martha. Doc's greeting acknowledged each person with the precise courtesy that had made him trusted confidant to 3 generations of Pine Ridge families. His gaze fell on the open notebook, and his expression shifted to one of genuine interest. "Those are impressive drawings, Mr. Brandt." The sketches revealed more than technical skill. They showed a vision of spaces that would shelter and comfort, designs that honored both function and beauty. There were plans for built-in seating that could serve as both furniture and storage, windows positioned to frame specific views of the surrounding mountains, details that spoke of someone who understood how people lived in small spaces. "Railroad's asking $50 for that car," Sheriff Cole said, his tone neutral but his eyes curious. "Most folks figure it's not worth hauling away for scrap." Elias closed the notebook. Carefully, his fingers gentle with the worn leather binding. "Sometimes, things that look worthless just need someone to see their possibilities." The statement hung in the morning air like an invitation to understanding. Martha found herself thinking of the pieces of furniture she'd glimpsed in those sketches, chairs that would be comfortable for reading, tables sized for solitary meals that wouldn't feel lonely, storage solutions that would keep a small space from feeling cramped. There was something about the drawings that suggested not just craftsmanship, but care. "That car's been sitting there 15 years, Doc observed. "Weather's gotten to it pretty good. Structure's still sound," Elias said with the confidence of someone who could read the language of wood and steel. "Foundation's solid. Most of what's wrong with it is what you can see from the outside." They walked together toward the abandoned spur line, their footsteps raising small clouds of dust that caught the strengthening sunlight. The train car sat where the railroad had left it, surrounded by the kind of weeds that grew in places where human attention had moved on to other concerns. From a distance, it looked like exactly what everyone said it was: a piece of junk that someone should have hauled away years ago. But as they approached, Elias's experienced eye began cataloging possibilities where others saw only problems. The frame remained true, its bones still strong beneath the surface rust. The windows, though broken, showed good proportions that would frame the mountain views beautifully once replaced. The roof, despite its obvious leaks, followed clean lines that spoke of the era when even utilitarian structures were built with attention to form as well as function. $50, Martha repeated, as if testing how the words sounded when applied to something that might actually be worth buying. Elias pulled out a small cloth pouch, the kind that working men used to keep their savings close. The coins inside had been earned through labor that left its mark on a man's hands, calluses from tools, scars from wood that had fought back, the particular strength that came from years of shaping raw materials into useful things. "Seems fair," he said simply, as if purchasing abandoned railroad cars was something he did every Tuesday morning. Sheriff Cole extended his hand for the money, then paused. "You mind me asking what you plan to do with it?" Elias looked at the car for a long moment, his gaze taking in details that the others couldn't see. In his mind's eye, he was already seeing past the rust and neglect of the structure underneath, already planning how each space would be used, how light would move through the renewed interior, how a man might live in such a place without feeling diminished by its size. "Make it into something worth keeping," he said finally. The transaction completed with handshakes that carried the weight of mountain trust. Elias Brandt now owned what most folks considered 40 feet of worthless metal and rotting wood. But as he walked around his purchase, notebook once again open to reveal his sketches, it became clear that he saw something the rest of them had missed. Martha lingered as the men dispersed to their morning duties. There was something about those drawings that stayed with her, something about the way they suggested not just a renovation project, but a homecoming of sorts. The sketches showed spaces designed for solitude without loneliness, for quiet without emptiness. "Mr. Brunt," she called as he prepared to leave, "you'll be needing supplies, tools, materials, that sort of thing." He turned back with the patient attention of someone who understood that mountain folk didn't offer help lightly. "Yes, ma'am. I expect I will. Store opens at 7. I keep good stock, fair prices." The offer carried more than commerce. In a place like Pine Ridge, where winter could isolate a man for months and the nearest city was a day's hard travel, the general store served as lifeline, meeting place, and community anchor. Martha's invitation was less about selling supplies than about welcoming someone who might, if things went well, become a neighbor worth knowing. As Elias walked back toward town, the leather notebook secure in his coat pocket, the morning sun began burning off the mist that had shrouded the valley. Behind him, the train car sat in the strengthening light, still looking to most eyes like nothing more than an expensive piece of junk. But appearances, as any craftsman worth his tools could tell you, often had very little to do with possibilities. 3 days later, Elias stood inside the train car with a kerosene lantern casting dancing shadows on walls that had forgotten the touch of human care. The interior smelled of rust and time, of rain that had found its way through compromised seals and seasons that had passed without witness. But beneath the neglect, his experienced hands found the solid bones of good construction, thick timber that had weathered decades, metal joints that still held true, the kind of craftsmanship that railroads had demanded when trains carried the nation's hopes as well as its cargo. He had spent the morning clearing debris, filling 3 wheelbarrows with the accumulated refuse of abandonment. Broken glass, rotted fabric, the skeletal remains of what had once been a conductor's desk. Each piece removed revealed more of the car's original character, like brushing dust from an old photograph to reveal the faces underneath. The afternoon brought Martha's grandson Tommy, a boy of perhaps 12, whose curiosity had finally overcome his shyness about the strange man who had bought the worthless train car. Tommy appeared at the doorway with the particular stillness of children who are trying not to be noticed while desperately hoping to be invited in. "Morning, son," Elias said, without looking up from the section of flooring he was examining. The boards here showed water damage but remained structurally sound, the kind of problem that looked worse than it was to anyone who understood wood. "Grandma Martha says you're fixing this place up," Tommy ventured, his voice carrying the careful politeness that mountain children learned early. "That's the plan." Elias straightened, joints protesting the movement in ways that reminded him of the years that had accumulated since he'd last undertaken such a project. "What do you think of it?" Tommy stepped inside, his young eyes taking in the space with the unbiased assessment that children brought to such evaluations. Where adults saw decay and discouragement, he saw possibilities that weren't constrained by practical concerns about time, money, or the likelihood of success. "It's bigger than it looks from outside," he observed, which showed the kind of spatial intelligence that Elias had always respected in the young. "What are you going to make it into?" The question hung in the air between them, weighted with more significance than either of them fully understood. Elias had been asking himself the same thing for 3 days, his mind cycling through the practical considerations of plumbing, heating, insulation. But beneath those surface concerns lay something deeper, something that had to do with the reason he had left his previous life and found himself in this forgotten corner of mountain country. From his coat pocket, he pulled a photograph that had been handled so often its edges had gone soft. The image showed a woman with kind eyes and a smile that suggested she had found the world more amusing than difficult. Beside her stood a young boy, perhaps 7 years old, with the serious expression that some children wore when they sensed the camera was capturing something important. "My wife, Sarah," Elias said simply. "And that's my boy, Daniel." Tommy studied the photograph with the respectful attention that children reserved for glimpses into the adult world's deeper currents. Even at 12, he understood that some pictures were not just images but memorials, windows into stories that had ended too soon. "Where are they now?" he asked, with the directness that adults had learned to soften, but children still possessed. "Gone," Elias replied, the single word carrying the weight of a longer story. He tucked the photograph back into his pocket with the careful movements of someone handling something irreplaceable. Fever took them both. Winter before last. Within 3 days of each other. The silence that followed held the particular quality of grief shared between strangers who understood that some losses were too large for comfort, too final for anything but acknowledgement. Tommy, with the intuitive wisdom that children sometimes displayed, didn't attempt to fill the quiet with words that would have been inadequate anyway. Instead, he moved deeper into the train car, his footsteps echoing in the hollow space. "If they could see what you're building here, what do you think they'd want it to be?" The question struck Elias with unexpected force, reaching past his careful planning and practical considerations to touch something he had been avoiding since the day he'd bought the car. He had been thinking in terms of structure and function, but Tommy's innocent inquiry demanded something more honest. "Sarah always wanted a place where people could come when they needed quiet," he said slowly, the words emerging as if he was discovering them while speaking. Not hiding exactly, but stepping away from noise and hurry. Somewhere a person could sit and think, or remember, or just be still for a while. "And your boy?" Daniel loved to build things. Little houses from scrap wood, castles from stones he found by the creek. He'd spend hours making something, then step back and admire it like he'd created a cathedral. The memory brought a smile that held more pain than joy, but was genuine nonetheless. He always said he wanted to make something beautiful that would last longer than he would. Tommy nodded with the gravity of someone much older. "So maybe you could make both things. A quiet place that's also beautiful." The simplicity of the suggestion cut through weeks of Elias's circular thinking. He had been approaching the project as if it was simply a matter of renovation, of returning the train car to some version of its original purpose. But Tommy's question had revealed a different possibility, not restoration, but transformation into something that honored both the dead and the living. That evening, after Tommy had returned to town, Elias sat on the train car's rear platform as sunset painted the mountains in shades of amber and gold. The photograph rested in his hands, and for the first time since leaving his old life behind, he allowed himself to imagine what Sarah and Daniel might think of this place he was creating. Sarah would have loved the way the light moved across the valley floor, the way shadows lengthened as evening approached. She had always been drawn to quiet beauty, to moments when the world revealed itself as something larger and more graceful than daily concerns suggested. This place, set apart from the rush of ordinary life, would have appealed to her sense of sanctuary, and Daniel, his boy, would have seen immediately what Elias was only now beginning to understand. This wasn't just about creating a place to live. It was about building something that would stand as testament to love that had been cut short, to dreams that had been interrupted but not erased. The realization brought with it a shift in his understanding of the project. The careful measurements in his notebook, the detailed sketches of furniture and built-ins, suddenly seemed less like plans for a dwelling and more like blueprints for a memorial. Not the kind carved in stone and meant for public display, but something more intimate, a place where the living could commune with memory, where the past could be honored without becoming a prison. As darkness settled over the valley, Elias made his way back to his room above the saloon, but his mind remained with the train car and the work that lay ahead. Tommy's innocent questions had unlocked something he hadn't known he was carrying, not just grief for what he had lost, but gratitude for what he had been given, even if only for a short time. The project had found its purpose, and that purpose changed everything. He was no longer simply renovating an abandoned piece of railroad equipment. He was creating a sanctuary where love could take physical form, where memory could be housed in something beautiful and lasting. Over the following days, word of the train car project began to spread through Pine Ridge with the quiet efficiency that characterized news in small communities. Martha mentioned it to customers who stopped by the general store. Doc Henley spoke of it to patients who needed distraction from their ailments. Sheriff Cole brought it up in conversations with ranchers who came to town for supplies. The response surprised Elias. Instead of the skepticism he had expected, people began offering help. Old Henrik, who ran the sawmill, mentioned that he had some good pine that had been seasoning for years, just looking for the right project. Mrs. Patterson, who taught school and knew the value of good books, wondered if he might want shelving for a small library. Even the Methodist minister, Reverend Clark, stopped by to admire the work and to observe, quietly, that some of the most important construction projects in human history had been undertaken not for practical purposes, but as acts of love and remembrance. The train car was becoming more than Elias's private project. It was evolving into something that the entire community had a stake in, a symbol of the possibility that broken things could be made whole, that abandonment was not the final word on anything worth preserving. But with that recognition came a weight of responsibility that Elias hadn't anticipated. He was no longer building just for himself, or even just for the memory of Sarah and Daniel. He was creating something that would need to serve a larger purpose, something that would need to justify the hope and interest that others were investing in it. Late at night, by lamplight, he revised his sketches with this new understanding guiding his hand. The space would still be intimate, still designed for quiet and reflection, but it would also need to accommodate visitors, to welcome others who might need what this place could offer. The challenge was creating something that could be both deeply personal and genuinely accessible, both memorial and sanctuary. The first real work began with the windows. Elias had learned long ago that natural light could make or break a small space, and the train car's original openings, though broken and weather-damaged, were positioned with the kind of thoughtfulness that suggested the original builders had understood this principle as well. He started each morning before sunrise, when the mountain air held the crisp promise of autumn, and his hands moved with the certainty that came from decades of practice. The broken glass came out in careful pieces, each shard wrapped in cloth and disposed of with the respect due to anything that had once served a useful purpose. Behind the glass, the window frames revealed themselves to be in better condition than he had dared hope. Solid wood that needed attention but not replacement, hardware that could be cleaned and oiled back to function. Martha appeared on the fourth morning of this work, carrying a basket that held the kind of breakfast that mountain women prepared for men undertaking serious labor. Hot coffee in a mason jar, eggs still warm from the pan, biscuits that had been baked before dawn and wrapped to hold their heat. She set the basket on the makeshift table he had constructed from sawhorses and planking, then stood quietly while he finished removing a particularly stubborn piece of glazing compound. "Old Henrik says you know what you're doing with wood," she observed, watching him work. There was no question in her voice, just the kind of assessment that people in small communities made about neighbors who might prove useful in difficult times. "Spent some years learning," Elias replied, setting down his chisel and accepting the coffee with hands that bore fresh cuts from the morning's work. The warmth felt good in the cool air, and the coffee carried the strength that he would need for the long day ahead. "He also says you turned down his offer to help with the framing." This was closer to a question, though still phrased as an observation. Martha had the gift of seeking information without seeming to pry, a skill that made her the unofficial keeper of the community's social boundaries. Her question touched on something that Elias himself wasn't entirely sure how to answer. "This is something I need to do myself," he said finally, aware that the explanation was incomplete, but hoping it would suffice. How could he explain that every nail driven, every joint cut, every surface smoothed, was part of a conversation with people who could no longer answer back? That accepting help, however well-intentioned, would somehow dilute the personal nature of what he was creating. Martha nodded as if his partial explanation was perfectly adequate. Henrik understands that. Said to tell you he'll keep those boards set aside for when you're ready for them. The breakfast sustained him through the morning's work of preparing the window openings for new glass. Each frame required individual attention. Some needed new sash cords. Others required the patient work of replacing sections of wood that weather had damaged beyond repair. It was the kind of detailed, methodical work that allowed his mind to wander while his hands stayed busy. By midday, the first of the new windows was ready for installation. Elias had ordered the glass from the supply company in Billings, paying extra for the clarity that would let the mountain light flood into the interior without distortion. The delivery had arrived the previous afternoon, each pane wrapped in brown paper and nested in wooden crates that spoke of careful attention to safe transport. Installing the first window felt like a small ceremony. As the glass settled into place and the afternoon light streamed through it to illuminate the train car's interior, the space began its transformation from derelict shell to something that could shelter human habitation. The light revealed details he had been working around: the grain of the wood flooring, the careful joinery of the original construction, the way the proportions of the interior created a sense of intimacy rather than confinement. Tommy appeared again as the afternoon wore toward evening, his timing suggesting that he had been watching from a distance and waiting for a natural break in the work. This time he carried his own offering, a mason jar filled with water and a sandwich wrapped in waxed paper. "Grandma Martha says a person can't work all day without eating," he explained, setting his burden on the makeshift table. His eyes went immediately to the newly installed window, and his expression showed the particular satisfaction that came from witnessing progress in a project that had captured his imagination. "That window changes everything," he said, which showed more understanding of the work than many adults would have demonstrated. "Makes it look like a real place instead of just a broken-down car." Elias accepted the sandwich with gratitude that went beyond hunger. There was something about the boy's attention, his genuine interest in the project, that reminded him of Daniel's enthusiasm for building things, not in a way that reopened the wound of his loss, but in a manner that honored the memory by recognizing similar spirit in a new young person. "Tomorrow, I'll install the rest of them," Elias said. "Once they're all in, you'll be able to see how the light moves through the space during different parts of the day. Can I help?" The question came with the particular hopefulness that children brought to requests that they weren't entirely sure would be welcomed. Elias considered this carefully. The work was dangerous in ways that a 12-year-old might not appreciate: sharp glass, heavy frames, tools that could cause serious injury if mishandled. But there were aspects of the project that could accommodate an eager assistant, tasks that would let Tommy contribute without putting himself at risk. "I could use someone to hand me tools," he said finally, "and to help organize the hardware. But you'd need to pay attention to what you're doing and follow directions exactly." Tommy's grin suggested that this qualified as one of the best offers he had received in recent memory. "I can do that. I'm good at following directions when they're for something important." The next morning brought Tommy early, arriving with the kind of punctuality that children displayed when they were genuinely excited about a project. He had brought his own work gloves, child-sized, but clearly well-used, and a canvas apron that suggested Martha had taken his new role seriously enough to provide proper equipment. Working with the boy changed the rhythm of the project in ways that Elias hadn't anticipated. Tommy's questions required him to explain not just what he was doing, but why each step mattered. The need to articulate his reasoning helped clarify his own thinking, forced him to examine assumptions and methods that had become automatic after years of practice. "Why do you measure twice before cutting?" Tommy asked, watching Elias mark a piece of trim for the second time. "Because wood doesn't grow back once you've cut it wrong," Elias replied. "And because taking time to be certain saves more time than rushing and having to start over." The lesson applied to more than carpentry, and Tommy seemed to understand this without needing it spelled out. He began applying the same principle to his own tasks, double-checking the organization of screws and nails, making sure he understood instructions before acting on them, taking pride in getting things right the first time. By the end of the second day of working together, all the windows were installed, and the train car's interior was flooded with the kind of natural light that transformed space from mere shelter into something approaching home. The afternoon sun streamed through the western windows, illuminating dust motes that danced in the golden air and revealing the richness of the wood grain that had been hidden in shadow. Tommy stood in the center of the space, turning slowly to take in the view from each window: mountains to the north, the valley floor spreading east toward town, the forest that climbed the southern slopes toward peaks still touched with early snow. The train car had become a viewing platform for the landscape that surrounded it, a place where someone could sit and contemplate the larger world while remaining sheltered and secure. "It's like being inside but also outside at the same time," he observed, which captured exactly what Elias had been hoping to achieve. The windows were just the beginning, but they represented something important, the first major step in transforming abandonment into sanctuary, neglect into careful attention. Each pane of glass was a promise that the work would continue, that something broken could be made whole through patient effort and clear intention. That evening, as Elias cleaned his tools and prepared to return to town, he felt the satisfaction that came from work that was both physically demanding and emotionally necessary. The train car was beginning to reveal its possibilities, and those possibilities were larger and more meaningful than he had initially imagined. With the windows complete, Elias turned his attention to the train car's roof, where winters of accumulated damage had created problems that would only worsen if left unaddressed. The work required him to climb onto the curved metal surface with tools and materials, a task that reminded him of his age in ways that window installation had not. His joints protested the awkward angles, and his balance wasn't quite what it had been in his younger years. Tommy noticed the difficulty and approached it with the practical problem-solving that mountain children learned early. Without being asked, he began positioning himself as a spotter, ready to steady a ladder or catch a dropped tool. His presence provided not just assistance, but the kind of confidence that came from knowing someone was paying attention, ready to help if help was needed. "My dad always says, 2 people make dangerous work safer," Tommy explained, when Elias commented on his attentiveness. "Even if the second person is just watching and handing up supplies." The boy's father worked for the Forest Service, spending long days maintaining trails and fire breaks in terrain where a moment's inattention could have serious consequences. Tommy had absorbed lessons about safety and preparation that served him well as an assistant on a project that involved heights, sharp tools, and heavy materials. The roofing work revealed the train car's fundamental soundness, while also exposing the extent of neglect it had endured. The metal structure remained solid, but years of weather had worked through compromised seals to damage the wooden framework underneath. Some sections could be repaired with careful patching, while others required complete replacement surgery rather than bandaging. Martha appeared mid-morning with Henrik, the sawmill owner, whose weathered face carried the particular lines that came from a lifetime of evaluating timber and making decisions about its best use. He studied the exposed roof structure with the eye of someone who understood both wood and the forces that worked against it over time. "Frame's good," he pronounced after a thorough examination. "Whoever built this car knew what they were doing, but you're going to need to replace about 1/3 of the decking and all the underlayment." Henrik had brought samples of the lumber. He had mentioned pine boards that had been cut from trees grown slowly in high-altitude conditions, their tight grain promising strength and stability. The wood carried the clean scent of mountain forests, and its honey-colored surface showed the kind of character that came from proper seasoning. "This timber's been drying for 3 years," Henrik continued, running his hand along one of the boards. "Cut it from trees that came down in that windstorm back in '98. Sometimes the best wood comes from trees that have had to struggle a little." The metaphor wasn't lost on any of them. Elias accepted the lumber with gratitude that went beyond its practical value. Henrik's gift represented more than material support. It was an investment in the success of the project, a vote of confidence from someone whose opinion carried weight in the community. The work of replacing damaged roof sections required patience and precision. Each new board had to be measured, cut, and fitted to match the curves of the original structure while accommodating the settling and slight warping that 15 years of weather had caused. It was the kind of work that couldn't be rushed, where each piece had to be perfect before the next could be installed. Tommy proved invaluable during this phase, his smaller hands able to reach into tight spaces to position brackets, and his keen eyesight able to spot alignment problems that Elias might have missed. Working together, they developed the kind of wordless communication that made collaborative work efficient, a gesture indicating where a tool was needed, a glance that confirmed measurements were correct. "Why don't you just tear the whole thing down and start over?" Tommy asked, during one particularly challenging afternoon when a warped section of roof had fought every attempt to fit properly. "Wouldn't it be easier?" The question touched on something that Elias had been thinking about throughout the project. Starting fresh would indeed be simpler in many ways, but it would also erase the history that made this particular train car worth preserving. The challenge was finding the balance between necessary change and respectful preservation. "Sometimes the hardest way turns out to be the most worthwhile," he replied, finally coaxing the stubborn board into position. "And sometimes working with what already exists teaches you things you wouldn't learn starting from scratch." The lesson applied to more than construction. Grief, Elias had discovered, couldn't be torn down and rebuilt from nothing. It had to be worked with, shaped and reshaped, until it became something that could support new growth while honoring what had come before. By the end of the week, the roof work was complete and the train car stood weatherproof for the first time in years. The new metal roofing caught the morning light and reflected it back in clean, bright lines that contrasted sharply with the weathered surfaces that hadn't yet received attention. But the contrast was temporary, a sign of work in progress rather than completion. Doc Henley arrived on Friday afternoon, ostensibly to check on how the work was progressing, but actually, Elias suspected, to satisfy his curiosity about what the interior would become. The old physician's trained eye took in the details of the construction with the same methodical attention he applied to examining patients. "You've thought about ventilation," Doc observed, noting the carefully positioned vents that would allow air to circulate without creating drafts. "And natural light. Important. Considerations for a space where people might spend considerable time." The comment suggested that Doc understood the project's purpose better than Elias had explained it to anyone. The train car was becoming more than a dwelling or workshop. It was evolving into a space designed for human comfort and contemplation, somewhere that would support both solitude and occasional gatherings. "Sarah always said that stuffy rooms made for stuffy thinking," Elias replied, surprised by how naturally the reference to his wife came. "And Daniel needed good light for his drawing." Doc nodded with the understanding of someone who had seen how environment affected human well-being. "This will be a healing place, I think. The town needs something like that." The observation carried weight, coming from someone who had spent decades tending to the community's physical and emotional ailments. Doc's endorsement felt like official recognition that the project served a purpose larger than Elias's personal need to create something beautiful from something abandoned. As autumn deepened and the first serious frost painted the valley floor white, the train car began to show its transformation more clearly. The exterior work roof, windows, foundation repairs created a shell that looked purposeful rather than derelict. Inside, the space waited for the detailed work that would define its character and determine how well it served its intended purpose. Tommy's enthusiasm for the project had grown along with his skills, and he began bringing friends to see the work in progress. Their reactions provided a different kind of validation. Young eyes that saw possibility rather than problems, imagination that wasn't constrained by practical concerns about heating costs or maintenance requirements. "It's like a secret hideout," one of them observed, "but for grown-ups." The description pleased Elias more than more sophisticated compliments might have. A secret hideout implied both refuge and discovery, exactly the combination he hoped to achieve. The interior work began with the floors, and it was here that Elias discovered the train car's most significant treasure. Beneath layers of accumulated grime and damaged surface boards lay the original hardwood flooring oak planks that had been milled from old-growth trees and installed with the kind of attention to detail that spoke of craftsmanship. From an era when such work was considered permanent, Tommy was the first to spot it, his sharp eyes catching the telltale grain pattern where a corner of the damaged surface had pulled away. "Mr. Brandt, look at this," he called, crouching beside the small revelation. "There's something good underneath all the bad stuff." Elias knelt beside the boy, his experienced fingers tracing the smooth surface of wood that had been hidden for years. The original flooring was not just intact, but beautiful, wide planks with the rich patina that came from age and quality. Discovering it felt like finding a letter from the past, a message from the craftsman who had built the car with the expectation that their work would outlast their own lives. "We'll need to strip everything down to this," Elias said, his mind already calculating the hours of careful work that would be required. "But it'll be worth it. This is the kind of flooring they don't make anymore." The restoration process required patience that tested even Elias's considerable reserves. Each damaged board had to be carefully removed without harming the treasure beneath. Some sections came up easily, their attachment weakened by years of moisture damage. Others clung stubbornly to their fastenings, requiring the kind of persuasion that could only be applied with hand tools and gentle persistence. Martha arrived on the third day of floor work, carrying her usual basket of sustenance, but also something else, a small wooden box that she handled with particular care. She set it beside the food and waited while Elias finished wrestling with a particularly stubborn section of damaged subflooring. "Found this in my attic," she said, when he paused to accept the coffee she offered. "Belonged to my grandfather. Thought you might have use for it." The box contained tools that hadn't seen regular use in decades, but had been maintained with the respect due to implements that had earned their keep through honest labor. Hand planes with blades that still held their edge, chisels that had been sharpened and oiled against rust, measuring devices crafted with the precision that modern tools often lacked. "Grandpa was a cabinet maker," Martha explained. "Built most of the good furniture in this valley back when people expected things to last for generations. These tools helped create pieces that are still serving families today." Accepting the tools felt like accepting a commission, a responsibility to uphold standards that had been set by men who understood the difference between adequate work and work that honored both material and purpose. Elias lifted each tool from its carefully padded resting place, his hands recognizing the balance and quality that came from instruments designed for precision rather than speed. "I'll take good care of them," he promised, understanding that the offer represented more than the loan of equipment. Martha was entrusting him with artifacts that connected the current project to a tradition of careful craftsmanship that stretched back through generations of mountain artisans. Working with the old tools changed the character of the project in subtle but important ways. The hand planes required attention to grain direction and blade angle that machine tools could ignore. The chisels demanded respect for the wood's natural characteristics, working with the material rather than forcing it into compliance. The pace slowed, but the quality of the results improved in ways that justified the additional time. Tommy watched this work with fascination, his young, mind-absorbing lessons about patience and precision that would serve him well, regardless of what paths his life might take. He learned to read the wood's grain, to understand how different sections would respond to different approaches, to recognize the subtle signs that indicated when a technique was working and when it needed adjustment. "Why does the old way take so much longer?" he asked one afternoon, watching Elias coax a perfect shaving from a stubborn piece of oak with a plane that was older than both of them combined. "It doesn't really," Elias replied, examining the translucent curl of wood that had emerged from the blade. "The quick way takes longer when you count all the time spent fixing mistakes and replacing things that weren't done right the first time." The lesson extended beyond woodworking, and Tommy seemed to grasp this without needing explicit explanation. He began applying the same principle to his own contributions to the project, taking time to organize hardware properly rather than rushing through the task, double-checking measurements before marking cuts, paying attention to details that might seem insignificant but that contributed to the overall quality of the work. The floor restoration revealed not just beautiful wood, but also the train car's original layout. Wear patterns in the oak showed where furniture had stood, where people had walked most frequently, where the conductor had worked at his small desk during long journeys. These ghost impressions suggested how the space had functioned in its original incarnation and provided clues about how it might serve its new purpose. Sheriff Cole stopped by during the second week of floor work, his timing suggesting that he had been keeping track of the project's progress from a respectful distance. His weathered face showed genuine appreciation for the craftsmanship he found, but his questions revealed concerns that went beyond admiration for good woodwork. "Town's talking," he said simply, settling onto a makeshift bench to watch Elias work. "Good talk, mostly, but talk nonetheless. People are curious about what exactly you're building here." The observation carried no criticism, but it highlighted something that Elias had been avoiding: the need to articulate his intentions to a community that had invested both materials and emotional support in the project's success. The train car was no longer just his private undertaking. It had become something that mattered to other people, and those people deserved some understanding of what their investment was creating. "A place for quiet," Elias said finally, the same answer he had given Tommy weeks earlier, but with new weight behind it. "Somewhere people can come when they need to step away from noise and hurry. Not hiding, but resting." Sheriff Cole nodded slowly, his expression suggesting that this explanation made sense within his understanding of human nature and community needs. "Town could use something like that," he agreed. "Place where a person could sit with their thoughts without feeling like they need to explain themselves to anyone." The conversation marked a turning point in how Elias understood his project. What had begun as a private act of memorial was evolving into something that served broader community needs, a recognition that many people carried losses and sorrows that required quiet spaces for proper processing. As winter approached and the interior work progressed, the train car began to reveal its potential as both sanctuary and gathering place. The restored oak floors gleamed in the afternoon light that streamed through the new windows, creating an atmosphere of warmth and permanence that invited contemplation without demanding it. The first real snow arrived on a Tuesday morning in November, transforming the valley into something that belonged in a child's picture book. Elias watched from inside the train car as fat flakes settled on the new windows, each one distinct before melting into the irregular patterns that winter painted on glass. The interior felt warm and secure, despite the wood stove being barely more than a sketch, in his notebook evidence that good insulation and careful attention to drafts could create comfort even in an unfinished space. Tommy appeared through the snowfall like a figure from a frontier story, his boots leaving clear tracks from town to the train car. Snow clung to his wool coat and the knit cap that Martha had made for him, but his cheeks glowed with the kind of vitality that mountain winters brought to people who knew how to dress for the cold. "Grandma Martha says this is just the beginning," he announced, stamping snow from his boots before entering. "Says we might get 3 feet before Christmas if the patterns hold true." The prospect of serious winter weather added urgency to the interior work that couldn't be postponed until spring. The wood stove needed to be installed and the chimney properly sealed. The walls required their final layer of insulation before the finish work could begin. Most importantly, the space needed to prove that it could serve its intended purpose during the long months when the outside world became harsh and unforgiving. Elias had spent considerable thought on the stove's placement, understanding that it would serve as more than just a source of heat. In a space designed for contemplation and quiet gathering, the stove would become a focal point, a source of both physical warmth and the particular comfort that came from watching flames dance behind glass doors. He had chosen a model that could burn either wood or coal, providing flexibility during the uncertain supply conditions that mountain winters sometimes brought. The installation required precision that went beyond simple functionality. The stove's position had to allow for efficient heat distribution while also creating a natural gathering point that didn't dominate the space. The chimney needed to follow building codes that hadn't existed when the train car was originally constructed, requiring modifications that respected the car's character while meeting modern safety requirements. Doc Henley arrived as Elias was wrestling with the chimney's passage through the roof, his medical bag suggesting he was making rounds, but his timing indicating genuine interest in the project's progress. At 74, Doc still climbed ladders and crawled through tight spaces with the agility of someone who had spent decades responding to emergencies in difficult locations. "Let me give you a hand with that," he offered, studying the complex angles where the chimney had to navigate around structural elements that couldn't be moved. "I've installed a few of these over the years. Trick is getting the flashing right so you don't trade warmth for leaks." Working with Doc provided Elias with insights that went beyond technical expertise. The old physician's questions revealed a deep understanding of how spaces affected human well-being, how the arrangement of furniture and light could influence mood and behavior in ways that most people never consciously noticed. "You've thought about seating arrangements," Doc observed, studying the sketches in Elias's notebook. "Multiple conversation areas, but also spots where someone could sit alone without feeling isolated." The comment showed more psychological sophistication than Elias had expected, though it shouldn't have surprised him. A man who had spent 50 years ministering to a small community's medical and emotional needs would naturally develop insights into what people required from their physical environment. "Sarah always said that the best rooms could accommodate whatever mood someone brought to them," Elias replied. "Cheerful enough for celebrations, quiet enough for sorrow, flexible enough for everything in between." The reference to his wife came more easily now, without the sharp edge of pain that had initially accompanied any mention of his loss. The train car project had somehow transformed memory from something that hurt into something that guided and instructed, a change that he hadn't expected but welcomed nonetheless. With the stove properly installed and the chimney drawing cleanly, the train car's interior took on the character that Elias had been envisioning since the day he'd bought it. The restored oak floors gleamed in the firelight, their rich patina enhanced by the dancing shadows that flames created. The carefully positioned windows framed views of the snow-covered landscape that changed throughout the day as light shifted and weather moved across the valley. The built-in furniture began taking shape during the short days of late November, each piece designed to serve multiple purposes while maintaining the clean lines that kept the space from feeling cluttered. Window seats provided both comfortable seating and storage for books, blankets, and the other items that accumulated. In any place where people gathered regularly, a small table could expand to accommodate several people for meals or contract to serve as a desk for solitary work. Tommy had become essential to this phase of the construction, his small hands able to reach into tight spaces where finished nails needed to be set, his keen eyesight able to spot alignment problems that could compromise the furniture's appearance and function. He had also developed an eye for proportion and detail that impressed Elias with its sophistication. "That shelf is a 1/4 inch too high," Tommy observed one afternoon, studying a bookcase that Elias had just positioned against the wall. "It looks fine, but it doesn't feel right with the window beside it." The boy was correct, and the adjustment he suggested improved both the bookcase's appearance and its relationship to the surrounding elements. Such observations had become common, evidence that Tommy was developing the kind of visual sensitivity that separated good craftsmen from merely competent ones. Mrs. Patterson, the schoolteacher, visited during the final week of November, bringing with her a selection of books that she thought might be appropriate for the small library that was taking shape along the train car's eastern wall. Her choices revealed careful thought about the kinds of reading that would serve people seeking quiet reflection, poetry that didn't demand analysis, essays that explored rather than argued, fiction that provided escape without requiring intense emotional investment. A place like this needs books that welcome rather than challenge, she explained, arranging volumes on shelves that smelled of fresh-cut pine and careful finishing. Reading that helps people settle into themselves rather than pushing them toward uncomfortable revelations. The library's completion marked another milestone in the train car's transformation from abandoned equipment to functioning sanctuary. Each book represented a conversation that visitors could join or ignore according to their mood and needs, company that made no demands but offered companionship to anyone who sought it. As December approached and the snow deepened around the train car's foundation, the interior work neared completion. The space had fulfilled its promise, becoming something that served both solitary contemplation and small gatherings, both memorial to what had been lost and celebration of what remained possible. But with completion came questions that Elias hadn't fully considered. How would the space be used? Who would have access to it? What responsibilities came with creating something that the community had invested in and supported? The train car was no longer just his project. It had become something larger and more complex, with implications that extended beyond his original intentions. The discovery came on a cold December morning when Elias was installing the final piece of trim around the interior windows. His measuring tape had slipped behind one of the built-in benches, and when he reached to retrieve it, his fingers encountered something unexpected: a small metal box wedged between the original framing and the floor. The box had been deliberately hidden, tucked into a space that would only be found by someone doing extensive renovation work. Its surface bore the patina of age, but showed no signs of rust, suggesting it had been wrapped or otherwise protected from moisture. The weight felt substantial in Elias's hands, and something inside shifted when he moved it, creating a soft rustling that suggested papers rather than coins or jewelry. Tommy was helping with the morning's work, organizing tools and hardware with the methodical attention that had become his trademark. He noticed immediately when Elias stopped working, his young face showing curiosity about the unexpected discovery. "What did you find?" he asked, setting aside the box of finish nails he had been sorting. "Not sure yet," Elias replied, examining the small clasp that held the box closed. The metal showed no signs of corrosion, but the mechanism felt stiff with age and disuse. "Looks like someone wanted to keep something safe." The box opened with a soft click that seemed to echo in the train car's interior. Inside, wrapped in oiled cloth that had protected them through decades of concealment, lay a collection of documents that immediately captured Elias's attention. The papers were carefully folded, their edges showing the yellowing that came with age, but their surfaces remaining clear and readable. The first document was a letter, written in the precise penmanship that belonged to an era when such skills were considered essential. The ink had faded to brown, but the words remained legible, and as Elias read them, he understood that he had discovered something that would change everything he thought he knew about the train car and his place in its story. "My dearest Margaret," the letter began, dated the 15th of October 1943. "If you are reading this, then the worst has happened, and I will not be coming home from this war. I write these words on what may be my final journey on the Denver and Rio Grande, carrying supplies to the port at Oakland. The car shakes with every mile, but my hand remains steady because I know these words will find their way to you eventually. Elias continued reading, his voice growing softer as the letter's contents revealed themselves. The writer was James Copper, a railroad man who had been called to serve in the Pacific Theater, leaving behind a wife and young son in Pine Ridge. The letter detailed his love for his family, his hopes for their future, and his careful instructions about a fund he had established to support them if he didn't survive the war. I have hidden the documents in this car because I know it will remain here, safe and forgotten, until someone like you, someone who understands the value of things that others overlook, finds them and ensures they doom to reach their proper destination. The money is in the First National Bank of Denver, account number 47382, established in my name and Margaret's. If I do not return, this money should go to our boy Tommy Copper when he reaches his 18th birthday. The name struck Elias like a physical blow. Tommy Copper. He looked at the boy beside him, Tommy, Martha's grandson, whose last name was indeed Copper, though Elias had never made the connection to the town's history. The coincidence seemed impossible, but as he continued reading, the pieces began falling into place. Margaret, if our boy grows up in Pine Ridge as we planned, he will know this train car. It has been my second home for 15 years, and I have always thought it would make a fine place for quiet thinking when a man needs to step away from the world's noise. Perhaps someday our son will understand why I chose to hide these papers here, in a place that represents both journey and rest, motion and stillness. Tommy had grown very quiet as Elias read, his young face showing the kind of concentration that came with trying to process information that challenged everything he thought he knew about his own story. When Elias finished the letter, the boy spoke with unusual formality. "My grandpa's name was James Copper," he said slowly. "Grandma Martha always said he died in the war before my dad was born. But she never talked about him much, said it was too hard to remember." The remaining documents in the box confirmed what the letter had suggested. There was a bank book showing regular deposits, a will that had never been probated, and a collection of photographs that showed a young man in railroad overalls standing beside the very train car that Elias had been restoring. In the final photograph, James Copper stood with a young woman and a toddler, the family that he had been forced to leave behind. The implications of the discovery were staggering. The train car wasn't just an abandoned piece of railroad equipment. It was a family legacy that had been waiting 75 years for the right person to uncover it. Tommy wasn't just Elias's eager assistant. He was the rightful heir to both the car and the funds that his grandfather had carefully preserved for him. "The money," Tommy said quietly, his practical mountain upbringing asserting itself despite the emotional magnitude of the revelation. "Is it still there?" Elias examined the bank documents more carefully, noting details that he had initially overlooked. The account had been established as a trust, designed to grow through interest and careful management until it was claimed by the designated heir. 75 years of compound interest would have transformed James Copper's railroad savings into something substantial. "We'll need to contact the bank," Elias said, his mind already working through the legal and practical implications of the discovery. "But yes, I think it's still there. Your grandfather was a careful man who understood how to protect what mattered most to him." The revelation recontextualized everything that had happened since Elias's arrival in Pine Ridge, his purchase of the train car, Tommy's immediate interest in the project, the community's unusually strong support for his renovation work. All of it took on new meaning when viewed as part of a story that had been unfolding for 3/4 of a century. Martha arrived for her usual morning visit to find Elias and Tommy sitting in stunned silence beside the open box, surrounded by documents that had just rewritten the boy's understanding of his own history. Her expression shifted from curiosity to shock as Elias explained the discovery and its implications. "James always said he would find a way to take care of us. she said softly, her voice carrying the weight of decades of grief and uncertainty. "I never imagined he meant it so literally." The train car project had been transformed from restoration to revelation, from memorial to homecoming. What Elias had undertaken as a private act of grief had become the key that unlocked a family mystery that had shaped 3 generations of Pine Ridge history. But with the discovery came new responsibilities and difficult questions. The money belonged to Tommy, but he was still a child who would need guidance in managing such an inheritance. The train car belonged to Elias legally, but morally it seemed to belong to the Copper family. And the community that had supported the restoration now faced the possibility that their gathering place might be claimed by its original owners. As snow continued to fall outside the windows, the 3 of them sat with the weight of revelation, understanding that everything they thought they knew about the project had just changed in ways that would require careful consideration and wisdom to navigate properly. The week following the discovery passed in a blur of phone calls, legal consultations, and careful examination of documents that had waited 3/4 of a century to see daylight. Elias found himself serving as intermediary between past and present, helping Martha and Tommy navigate the complex emotions that came with sudden inheritance, while also grappling with his own changed relationship to the project that had consumed his autumn. Doc Henley arrived on Wednesday morning with information that added both clarity and complexity to the situation. His own family had lived in Pine Ridge since before the war, and his father's papers contained references to the Copper family that provided context for James's careful preparations. "Your grandfather borrowed money from 3 families in town to make those bank deposits," Doc explained to Tommy, spreading photocopied documents on the train car's new table. He worked extra shifts, took on dangerous runs that paid better, did everything he could to build that account before shipping overseas. The whole community knew he was preparing for the worst. The revelation added weight to Tommy's inheritance, making it clear that the money represented not just one man's savings, but a community's investment in caring for their own. James Copper had transformed individual sacrifice into collective responsibility, creating a legacy that honored both family and neighbors. Sheriff Cole joined them that afternoon, bringing legal expertise that helped clarify the formal steps required to claim an inheritance that had been abandoned so long it had passed into legend. The process would be complex, requiring probate proceedings that could take months, but the documentation was thorough enough to make success virtually certain. "The interesting question," Cole observed, studying James Copper's will with professional attention to detail, "is what happens to the train car itself. Technically, you bought it from the railroad, Elias, and that transaction is legal and binding. But morally speaking, this car belongs to the Copper family." The statement articulated the dilemma that had been troubling Elias since the discovery. He had purchased the train car honestly and invested months of labor and emotional energy in its restoration. But learning about James Copper's connection to it changed everything, making his ownership feel temporary and conditional. Tommy, with the directness that children brought to complex adult problems, cut through the legal and ethical complications with startling clarity. "Mr. Brandt, you said this place was supposed to be somewhere people could come for quiet thinking, right? Somewhere that would honor people who died too soon?" Elias nodded, uncertain where the boy's reasoning was leading, but recognizing the serious tone that indicated careful consideration rather than childish impulse. "Then maybe it doesn't matter who owns it," Tommy continued. "Maybe what matters is making sure it serves the purpose you and my grandpa both wanted it to serve." The suggestion carried wisdom that impressed all 3 adults, but it also raised practical questions about liability, maintenance, and governance that would need to be addressed before any such arrangement could be formalized. How could a 12-year-old boy and a grieving widower share ownership of property that was becoming increasingly important to the entire community? Martha's solution came from her decades of experience in managing the complex relationships that sustain small mountain communities. "What if we establish a trust?" she proposed. Something that recognizes both Tommy's inheritance and Elias's investment, but dedicates the property to serving the community's needs. The idea had merit, but implementing it would require legal expertise that none of them possessed. Doc Henley suggested contacting his nephew, a lawyer in Billings who specialized in estate planning and community development. The consultation would take time to arrange, and winter weather was making travel increasingly difficult. Meanwhile, the word of the discovery had spread through Pine Ridge with the speed that characterized news in small communities. People who had supported the restoration project with materials, labor, and encouragement now faced the possibility that their gathering place might become private property again, unavailable for the community use they had been anticipating. Henrik appeared on Friday morning with a different kind of offering, not lumber or tools, but perspective gained from 70 years of watching Pine Ridge navigate change and uncertainty. He settled onto one of the built-in benches, his weathered hands appreciating the smooth finish that his own wood had helped create. "Communities like ours survive by adapting," he said, his voice carrying the authority of someone who had seen the town through boom and bust, war and peace, growth and decline. "What matters isn't who owns what, but whether people can find what they need when they need it." The comment addressed the underlying tension that the discovery had created. The train car had been restored with community support because people believed it would serve community needs. If legal complications prevented that use, the goodwill and cooperation that had made the project possible might not be available for future endeavors. Reverend Clark arrived that afternoon with Mrs. Patterson, both of them representing the community's concern about how the ownership question might be resolved. Their visit was diplomatic rather than confrontational, but their message was clear. The town had invested emotionally in the train car's transformation, and that investment deserved consideration in whatever resolution emerged. "We're not claiming any legal right to the property," Reverend Clark clarified, his tone carefully measured. "But we are hoping that whatever arrangement you work out will honor the spirit of cooperation that made this restoration possible." Mrs. Patterson's contribution was more specific, focusing on the library that she had helped establish and the role she had envisioned it playing in the community's cultural life. "Those books were chosen specifically for this space," she explained. "Poetry readings, discussion groups, quiet study. We've already started planning activities that would use this place in ways that serve everyone." The pressure wasn't hostile, but it was real. The community that had supported the project expected their investment to be honored, and any resolution that excluded them from using the finished space would create lasting resentment. Elias found himself in the uncomfortable position of mediating between legal ownership and moral obligation, between his personal attachment to the project and his responsibility to neighbors who had made its success possible. Tommy seemed less troubled by the complexity than the adults around him. His approach to the problem remained characteristically direct. The space should serve its intended purpose regardless of who technically owned it. But his confidence in that solution depended on assumptions about adult behavior that might not prove accurate when tested by formal legal proceedings. As the weekend approached, Elias realized that the ownership question couldn't be resolved through informal discussions and good intentions. The inheritance was too valuable, the property too significant, the community investment too substantial to be managed without proper legal framework. But obtaining that framework would require decisions that he wasn't prepared to make alone. The train car itself seemed to wait patiently, while the humans around it worked through complications that had nothing to do with carpentry or craftsmanship. The restored space fulfilled every expectation that Elias had held for it: warm, welcoming, conducive to both solitude and small gatherings. But its legal status remained as unsettled as mountain weather, subject to forces beyond anyone's immediate control. Saturday evening found Elias alone in the train car, the wood stove casting dancing shadows on walls that held both his own work and the ghost of James Copper's original vision. The photograph of Sarah and Daniel rested on the mantel he had built, keeping company with the picture of James Copper's family that had emerged from the hidden box. Both families had been cut short by tragedy, but both had left legacies that extended beyond their own brief time. Sarah and Daniel lived on in the careful attention that Elias brought to creating beauty from abandonment. James Copper's love for his family had preserved resources and guidance that were still serving their intended purpose decades after his death. The parallel wasn't lost on Elias, and it suggested a resolution that honored both past and present, while pointing toward a future that served needs larger than individual ownership. But implementing such a resolution would require courage, generosity, and wisdom from everyone involved, qualities that weren't guaranteed, even in communities that valued cooperation and mutual support. Sunday morning would bring new conversations, additional complications, and the need for decisions that would determine whether the train car's restoration remained a triumph of community spirit or became a source of lasting division. Sunday morning brought the kind of snowfall that transformed the world into something clean and new, blanketing the valley in white silence that seemed to muffle not just sound, but the weight of human complications. Elias stood at the train car's east window, watching the flakes settle on pine branches that bent under accumulating burden but did not break. Martha arrived earlier than usual, her footsteps creating the first tracks through snow that reached almost to her knees. She carried no basket this morning, no offering of food or coffee, just the determined expression of someone who had reached conclusions that required immediate action. "We need to settle this today," she said without preamble, stamping snow from her boots before entering the warmth of the restored interior. Before the lawyers get involved and turn something simple into something expensive and complicated. Her directness surprised Elias, though it probably shouldn't have. Mountain people learned to address problems before they became crises, and Martha had spent decades managing conflicts that could have torn the community apart if handled poorly. Her tone suggested that she had developed a plan overnight, one that she expected would resolve the ownership question in ways that served everyone's interests. Tommy appeared through the snowfall as if summoned, his young face showing the serious expression that had become familiar whenever adult decisions required his input. He settled beside the wood stove, his attention focused on the adults who would determine how his grandfather's legacy would be handled. "I've been thinking about what James would want," Martha continued, settling onto one of the built-in benches that Elias had crafted with such care. He wasn't the kind of man who thought in terms of individual ownership when it came to things that mattered. He believed in taking care of people, in making sure good things served their proper purpose. The observation carried the authority of someone who had known James Copper personally, who could speak to his character and values from direct experience rather than speculation. Her assessment suggested that the solution might lie not in legal technicalities, but in understanding what the original owner would have wanted for his property. Doc Henley arrived as Martha was speaking, his timing suggesting coordination rather than coincidence. Behind him came Sheriff Cole, then Henrik, then Mrs. Patterson and Reverend Clark. Within 15 minutes, the train car held more people than it had accommodated since Elias had begun the restoration, the community's leadership gathering to address a problem that affected them all. "We've been talking," Doc said, his words acknowledging the informal discussions that had taken place throughout the weekend. Not planning or plotting, just trying to understand what would be best for everyone involved. The phrase, "everyone involved," carried weight in a community where individual decisions inevitably affected neighbors, where private property existed within networks of mutual dependence that made pure independence impossible. What happened to the train car would influence relationships and expectations throughout Pine Ridge. Sheriff Cole pulled out a folder of documents that he had been preparing since Friday, legal papers that outlined the various options available for resolving the ownership question. His presentation was thorough but accessible, designed to help lay people understand choices that would normally require professional legal advice. Simplest solution is for Elias to keep ownership, and Tommy to claim his inheritance separately, Cole explained. Clean, legal lines, no complications. But it doesn't address the community investment in this project. The alternative options were more complex, but potentially more satisfying for everyone involved. Trusts, partnerships, community ownership structures each had advantages and disadvantages that would need to be weighed carefully before any decisions were made. Tommy listened to the adult discussion with attention that seemed unusual for a 12-year-old, but his expression suggested that he was processing information rather than simply enduring boring conversation. When Sheriff Cole finished his presentation, the boy spoke with the directness that had become his trademark. "What did my grandfather's letter say about what he wanted?" Tommy asked, his question cutting through legal complexities to focus on human intentions. "Not the money part, but the part about the train car itself?" Elias retrieved the letter from its careful storage, reading aloud the passage that had stuck in his own mind since the discovery. James Copper's words about the car being a fine place for quiet thinking when a man needs to step away from the world's noise suddenly carried new weight. When spoken to a gathering that included the community's decision-makers, he wanted it to be a sanctuary, Martha said quietly, a place that belonged to anyone who needed what it could offer. The interpretation felt right to everyone present, aligning with their understanding of James Copper's character while also supporting the vision that had guided the restoration project. But translating that shared understanding into legal reality would require structure and commitment that went beyond good intentions. Mrs. Patterson offered the solution that had been developing through their weekend conversations. "What if we establish the Pine Ridge Community Trust?" she proposed. "Something that could hold title to properties like this one, ensuring they serve community needs while respecting the rights of people who invest in their development." The idea had precedent in other mountain communities that faced similar challenges: how to preserve spaces and resources that mattered to everyone without discouraging the individual initiative that made preservation possible. Done properly, such arrangements could encourage rather than constrain private investment in community assets. Henrik supported the proposal with practical observations about maintenance and governance. "Place like this needs ongoing care," he noted. "Someone has to split wood, shovel snow, fix things that break. Community ownership works when community members take responsibility." The comment addressed a crucial issue that pure ownership couldn't resolve. The train car's value to the community depended not just on access, but on stewardship, on people caring enough to maintain what they had helped create. Legal title was less important than emotional investment, though both were necessary for long-term success. The silence that followed Mrs. Patterson's proposal held the weight of decision, the moment when good intentions either found practical expression or dissolved into wishful thinking. Elias looked around the circle of faces, neighbors who had become friends, strangers who had become collaborators, a boy who had become the unexpected heir to dreams deferred by war and death. Tommy broke the quiet with the clarity that children brought to moments when adults overcomplicated simple truths. "Mr. Brandt," he said, his voice carrying formality that acknowledged the seriousness of what he was about to propose, "would you be willing to be the first trustee to make sure this place serves the purpose you and my grandfather both wanted?" The question struck Elias with unexpected force. He had spent months pouring his grief and skill into transforming abandonment into sanctuary, never imagining that his work would lead to a position of formal responsibility for something larger than his own healing. But Tommy's trust, offered with the generosity that characterized the boy's approach to complicated adult problems, demanded a response that honored both the gift and the giver. "I'd be honored," Elias replied, understanding that his acceptance transformed the train car project from personal memorial into community covenant. "But only if others join me. Something this important shouldn't depend on one person's judgment." Martha nodded with approval that suggested she had anticipated this response. "Doc and I have already talked about serving alongside you," she said. "Henrik too, and Mrs. Patterson, a board of trustees that represents different aspects of what this community values. The structure was taking shape with the organic logic that characterized successful mountain solutions, practical enough to work, flexible enough to adapt, rooted in personal relationships that made formal agreements meaningful rather than merely legal. But it still required Tommy's consent to proceed, since the resolution depended on his willingness to share his inheritance with the community that had supported its discovery. The money from the bank account, Sheriff Cole said carefully, that remains entirely yours, Tommy. No one's asking you to share your grandfather's financial legacy. But the train car itself, that's different. That's become something that belongs to all of us in ways that pure ownership can't capture. The distinction was important, preserving Tommy's inheritance while acknowledging the community investment that had transformed the train car from abandoned equipment into functioning sanctuary. It honored both James Copper's intentions for his family and the collective effort that had made those intentions reality after 3/4 of a century. Tommy stood and walked to the window where afternoon light illuminated the snow-covered valley, his small figure silhouetted against the landscape that would shape his entire life. When he turned back to face the gathered adults, his expression showed the kind of determination that suggested he had inherited more than money from his grandfather. "My grandpa wrote that this place should be for quiet thinking," he said, his words measured and deliberate. He wanted it to help people who needed to step away from noise and hurry. If making it community property helps it do that better, then that's what we should do. The simplicity of his reasoning cut through the legal complexities that had been troubling the adults, reducing the question to its essential elements: purpose over ownership, service over possession, legacy over legal title. His willingness to share what was rightfully his transformed the gathering from negotiation into celebration. Doc Henley produced documents that he had prepared over the weekend, articles of incorporation for the Pine Ridge Community Trust that would hold title to the train car while ensuring its dedication to public purpose. The paperwork was preliminary, requiring legal review and formal filing, but it provided structure for the agreement they were crafting. The trust can own other properties too, as opportunities arise, Doc explained. The old schoolhouse maybe, or the bandstand in the park. Places that matter to the community, but that no individual should have to maintain alone. The vision was larger than the train car, encompassing a model for preserving community assets that were too important to be left to chance or private whim. The trust would provide legal framework for collective stewardship, ensuring that places that served community needs would continue to serve them regardless of individual circumstances. Reverend Clark offered to conduct a blessing ceremony when the legal papers were finalized, recognizing the train car's transformation as something worthy of formal acknowledgement. Not dedication, exactly, he clarified, but recognition that some human efforts deserve community gratitude and divine blessing. As afternoon faded toward evening and snow continued to fall outside the windows, the gathering took on the character of founding rather than mere problem-solving. They were creating something new, not just a solution to the ownership question, but a template for how communities could preserve what mattered most to them while honoring the individuals who made preservation possible. The restored train car, warm with firelight and filled with voices planning its future, stood as proof that abandoned things could find new purpose when the right people invested the right kind of care. James Copper's sanctuary had finally found its way home. Spring arrived early that year, melting the snow that had blanketed the valley through the long months when the Pine Ridge Community Trust evolved from hopeful idea into functioning reality. By April, wildflowers carpeted the meadow around the train car, and the morning light that streamed through its windows carried the promise of renewal that mountain seasons brought to those patient enough to wait for them. Elias stood on the rear platform of what everyone now called the sanctuary, watching Tommy help Mrs. Patterson arranged chairs for the afternoon's poetry reading. The boy had grown taller through the winter months, but more importantly, he had grown into the responsibility that came with being part of something larger than himself. His movements around the space showed the confidence of someone who belonged there, who had earned his place through contribution rather than inheritance. The bank account in Denver had indeed grown substantially over 7 decades, providing Tommy with resources that would support his education and whatever future he chose to pursue. But the money had proved less transformative than the discovery itself, which had connected him to a family history that gave weight and context to his place in the community's ongoing story. Martha emerged from the train car's interior, carrying the brass plaque that Henrik had crafted to commemorate James Copper's vision and sacrifice. The inscription was simple but complete: "In memory of James Copper, 1915 to 1944, who understood that the best legacies serve purposes larger than the people who create them." The plaque would be mounted beside the door during tomorrow's dedication ceremony, marking the train car's official transformation from private restoration project to community asset. But the physical marker was less important than the understanding it represented that some human efforts created value that belonged to everyone willing to preserve and protect it. Doc Henley arrived with the final legal documents that formalized the trust's ownership of the property, papers that had required months of careful review, but that now provided the security that community investment demanded. His satisfaction was visible as he handed the folder to Elias, recognizing the completion of work that had required as much patience as the restoration itself. "Lawyer in Billings says he's never seen a cleaner transfer of property rights," Doc reported. "Everything in order. Everyone's interests protected, community benefit clearly established. Says he might use this as a model for similar situations." The compliment carried weight coming from legal professionals who dealt regularly with property disputes that divided rather than united communities. The Pine Ridge solution had succeeded precisely because it honored competing interests rather than forcing choices between them. Sheriff Cole joined them as the afternoon's visitors began arriving, families from town, ranchers from the surrounding valley, even people from as far away as Billings who had heard about the restored train car and wanted to see what community cooperation could accomplish. The steady stream of respectful guests validated the decision to make the space publicly accessible while maintaining its character as a place for quiet reflection. Tommy moved among the visitors with the easy grace of someone who understood his role as both host and beneficiary, answering questions about his grandfather's story while also explaining how the restoration had been accomplished. His pride was obvious, but not boastful, grounded in appreciation for work that others had done as much as inheritance he had received. The poetry reading drew people who might never have attended such an event in a more formal setting, but who found something appealing about literature shared in a space that felt both intimate and welcoming. Missus. Patterson's selections honored the themes that had guided the restoration: memory and loss, healing and renewal, the possibility of creating beauty from broken things. As evening approached and the last visitors departed, Elias found himself alone in the sanctuary with the photograph of Sarah and Daniel, their images sharing mantle space with James Copper's family portrait in an arrangement that felt both natural and intentional. The two families, separated by decades but united by early loss, had somehow collaborated across time to create something that honored them both. The train car had fulfilled every hope that Elias had held for it when he'd paid his $50 and begun the work of transformation. It served as memorial to those who had died too soon, sanctuary for those who needed quiet space, and gathering place for a community that had discovered the rewards of preserving what mattered most to them. But more than that, it had become proof that abandonment was never the final word on anything worth saving. With patience, skill, and the kind of love that looked beyond immediate appearances to underlying possibilities, even the most discarded things could find new purpose and renewed life. The setting sun painted the valley in shades of gold and amber, the same light that had blessed this place when James Copper first walked these rails, when Sarah and Daniel had shared their brief time with Elias, when Tommy had asked his innocent questions that changed everything. Some things endured despite loss, because people chose to make them endure. The train car sat quietly in that light, no longer abandoned but never finished, continuing the work of transformation that would last as long as people understood the value of what they had helped create. The whistle of the evening freight train echoed across the valley, a sound that James Copper would have recognized, calling travelers home to places where they were known and welcomed, where their stories became part of something larger than themselves. In the growing dusk, the sanctuary's windows glowed with warm light that promised shelter to anyone who needed what it offered, not just physical refuge, but the deeper comfort that came from knowing that some human efforts created lasting value, that love expressed through patient work could bridge any gap that time and loss might create. The mountain man who had bought a rusty train car for $50 had built something that would take your breath away. But more importantly, he had built something that would help you catch it again, in a place where memory and hope could finally make their peace.